Yeah.
Is it right, by the way, that in China people don't actually drive? They don't go in for long drives. That people
Yeah.
prefer railways and
Uh-huh.
the trains and the aircraft, and
Yes.
that
Yes.
this is why electric cars make so much sense in China, because
Yeah.
they're basically for urban use.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, more and more people are doing driving. It just
Yeah,
hasn't
yeah,
totally emerged
yeah,
into, because having
mm,
car is a relatively recent phenomenon,
yeah, yeah,
private cars. So
yeah.
people are still get used to it. And in the meantime, like you said, the trains are very convenient. I like to ride
Oh,
trains. And
yeah, yeah.
so
If we had
so lots of,
if we had a railway system that worked here in Britain, I would prefer them as well. Actually, trouble
yeah,
is we don't. Yeah,
it's comfortable, right?
yeah,
And you can
yeah.
do a lot of things on the train. It's very quiet, at least in my experience, and very,
Mm,
sturdy. So
mm,
I personally prefer trains, but more and more people are driving, and lots of them during the holidays, take the
mm,
families. They do that. It's
mm,
getting more common,
mm,
and there's infrastructure building, our building to accommodate those things as well.
mm,
So,
mm, mm, good.
all right, another eventful week.
Always, always. Well, the world is an eventful place, actually.
So,
So there we go. As I
all
said,
right,
China is the oasis of calm
yeah,
in the
I
middle of
agree.
this swirling sea.
Uh-huh.
I mean, all this
Yeah,
goes on all around, but China remains stable and steady,
yeah.
carries on doing what it's doing. Everyone else going mad all around it, but they seem to be. Are we going to touch on Kishida stepping down? I presume
Yes, yes.
that's. I don't know how you pronounce his name, but anyway, I'm
That's
sure
how I
that's
pronounce it, Kishida. Yeah, he just did.
Kishida.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he's not going to seek. I mean, he resigned from the party. We can start there
yeah.
then. We can start with
Yeah.
Kishida.
Well,
Now, in
whatever
general,
you. But no, your interview. You start where you want to start. Obviously.
well,
Okay.
just
Yeah.
regarding China, I think the part of the reason China is can keep peace. I think also the neighboring countries, the ASEAN countries in particular, they don't want to get into
Yeah.
the situation like Europe. I
Yeah.
think, we will talk a little bit about
Yeah.
Vietnam and the Philippines, etc. But other than those two, they are still relatively small country compared to China. But also the rest of ASEAN countries not interested. They're not
Mm.
interested in getting involved.
Absolutely.
I think
Absolutely.
that has a lot to do with it. That they
Absolutely.
the Asian country in general, you don't hear a lot about them.
Mm.
They don't sanction this, criticize that, protesting.
Yeah.
They don't do that.
No.
But they are watching, and the countries like Indonesia, right, Malaysia,
Yeah.
they are watching. They see,
Yeah.
they know what's going on,
Yeah.
and they don't want
Exactly.
that. They don't want
Exactly.
the Asian to become like uh, Europe or Middle East,
Mm.
something like that. So,
Yeah.
and I think that's part of that too. It's
I agree. I agree.
yeah.
I agree.
Okay, so let's start with Kishida. Well, what did you
Yeah.
take? Now, actually, when Biden dropped out of the race, they were already people were talking that he will be the next, that he probably will resign from his
Mm.
party leader, which essentially he's not going to seek the re-election to be the next prime minister of Japan.
Mm.
He has never been really popular in Japan. It seems like
No.
he didn't do much. So, what is your take on that?
Well,
That
I
he's
don't think he may not have been popular before, but one can say now that he is extremely unpopular now. As I saw the latest opinion poll in Japan, and it suggests that the Kishida cabinet has just 15% support. I mean, it's derisory. I mean, it's even worse than the Sunak cabinet in London. And bear in mind, he leads the Liberal Democratic Party, which has been the dominant party in Japan ever since the 1950s. It has, enormous clientage, support base across the country. You would expect that the Prime Minister cabinet led of the Liberal Democratic Party would be a lot more popular than it is. And I think this is actually a testament to the realities of what the Kishida government has done, because Kishida, even more than most Japanese prime ministers, has unswervingly followed the lead of the United States and of the Biden administration. And he's taken Japan, in my opinion, in a very dangerous direction. I mean, he's led it into confrontation with Russia. where the previous Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, who I understand is not a particularly popular figure in China either, and for very good reasons. But anyway, Shinzo Abe was at least trying to improve relations with Russia, even if he was making them worse with China. Anyway, Kishida has wrecked relations with Russia completely. Even whilst doing that, he has continued Abe's policy of confrontation with China and made that worse. He's begun a program of militarization of, Japan, increasing military spending, trying to get military spending up to NATO levels. This is a country which still has what is supposed to be a pacifist constitution. And, he's completely reversing all of that. Frenetic, in fact, military build-up under Kishida's government. And of course, even as he's been leading Japan into confrontations with its neighbors and subordinating Japan into a clientage relationship with the United States and worsening relations with China and wrecking relationships with Russia and doing all of these things, the Japanese economy continues to not do especially well. And I mean, he hasn't really been trying to do much about that. And Shinzo Abe, whatever you may think of him, did at least take Japan's economic problems seriously. He never cured them or came close to. He never came close to devising any real constructive ideas as to how to turn the situation round. But he did try some things. I get the sense that Kishida wasn't even interested. So we've had, policies that, trying to reduce interest rates and then increase interest rates, fiscal policies, which again make no very great sense. The economy continues to remain very sluggish. There's no sign that its long-term erosion, its decline, is being reversed in any serious way, to the extent that we ever hear about anything being done in Japan, like Japan's attempts to get back into semiconductors. It all looks like it's basically another attempt to pursue the confrontation with China, rather than to do anything to correct the underlying problems of Japan's economy. And you hear that Japan's population is getting older. The Japanese people have fewer and fewer children, in fact, very few children. And, one gets the sense of a country that is in a bad way, or at least feels itself to be in a bad way. The good times have passed, and a prime minister who really wasn't interested in solving its problems, but was instead following the policies of the United States. I'm going to quickly say, I think there is a solution to Japan's problems. And I don't think it's a difficult one. I think, in fact, it's a very obvious one, which is that Japan works closely and successfully with its neighbors. That instead of pursuing a policy of confrontation with China, it develops relations with China. I remember back in the 1980s and 90s when Japan was at the forefront of investing in China and developing, businesses and doing all kinds of things together with China. And it could do that too. And, it could develop good relations with Russia, continue to import its energy from Russia, get reliable energy, just like Germany used to do. Yeah. So, I mean, there is an alternative policy, one which, combined with an intelligent, strategic industrial policy, such as Japan once knew how to do, I think it could turn the situation around and give the Japanese people that sense of hope that might start making them feel more confident about their country, deciding to bring up families again, doing those sort of things. But instead, Kishida, like most of the members of his party and the Japanese elite, seems stuck in this sense of psychological dependence on the United States, which leads him to just carry on following American orders, even as these make Japan's situation worse and worse.
Well, some people we always go back to this question. Does the Japanese leader willingly to, worsen their relationship with China? Or they have to because US wants them to do so. I mean, another thing is there's in the Chinese media, they're speculating that Kishida resigned partially is because he's afraid of the US is angry with him because Japan recently increased the interest rate, which apparently make US not very happy, feel like they cannot control him. So he resigned. Now, partially he's probably not going to be elected, but also he's afraid that the US is doing something, etc. There are those kind of speculation as well. What's your take on that?
Well, I don't know whether the last is true, but let's assume that it is, and it could very well be, because the Biden administration, the Democrats, are not at all happy with the Japanese decision to raise interest rates, which, as we know, created a shock in the markets and led to talk about an American recession, which is absolutely not what the Democrats want in the run-up to the election in November. So, I can very well understand why the US is angry about all of this, or at least the Democrats are. And of course, they're the government of the US at the moment, and that might have been taken out on Kishida and on the Japanese central bank as well. So, I can see all of this. But if so, then of course that begs the question, because is Kishida quitting because the Japanese don't like him? Or is he quitting because the Americans don't like him? If it's the second, then that tells you exactly who really runs things in Japan.
Yeah, it could be both. That in his, he just ran out of options, right? He doesn't have any support. Then he has to go. Yeah. Okay. I think we're talking about China. Now, it's not totally, calm in Asia either. So the latest thing, I'm sure you have read it, inside out about this canal that is now Cambodia is going to build.
Yeah.
Okay, the Funan Canal. It's actually, I would say, geopolitically almost like a game changer canal. It's very significant because that's why lots of people in the social media in China are talking about it. Now, main thing is it got a diversion from the Mekong River go to Cambodia, so that Cambodia will have an opening to the ocean. So it will have a harbor. So far, up until now, the Mekong River will go all the way to Vietnam, and Vietnam has the control of the harbor there.
Yeah.
That's including Cambodia and all the other countries along the road if they want to have, goods and services goods going to do the trade. Now, Cambodia has been wanting this canal for a long time. It's interesting how the Western media report on this thing because they call this canal controversial. From Cambodia's perspective, there is nothing controversial about it. They, in fact, the starting date, I think 3 days ago, Cambodia made it a national holiday. So they are so happy about this. The Cambodian leader said that we can finally breathing from our own nose. So that's just give you an idea how Cambodia really want this, because their goods has been so far been controlled by Vietnam, and Vietnam actually did block them, I think twice at least that I can read. So now they can have their own. But it's also significant for China because in the meantime, on top there, Laos, China is building high-speed rail and also helping Laos is building a nuclear power actually. So it seems like China is doing this, opening up a whole new, and then on top there is Yunnan, China's western province. So open up the whole gate here, this whole way. So that's the significant part of it. The reason it's so-called controversial is because Vietnam is very unhappy about this. But just so I'm sure you know that, just to recap, the reason this whole thing being built actually, first of all, it's not a secret that Cambodia wants this. So China knows that Cambodia, but Cambodia doesn't have the means to do it. It costs, I think 1.7 billion or something dollars. So totally sponsored by, paid by China, and of course China's, technology, etc. There are two things, and then because of this so significant for Vietnam, China was cautious. China has been trying to avoid to do this because Vietnam is not happy, but Vietnam did two things I think really upset China. One is that it filed, I think last month, it filed a UN claim to extend the continental shelf in the South China Sea. Why did Vietnam do that? I don't know. And then to make matter worse, they just recently did a joint military drill with the Philippines. So I think
Yeah.
those are the two things. I mean, there are other things too. Those are the two things that really angered China. Finally, China said, okay, let's start building this canal. What is your take on the whole thing?
Well, I think you've described it all very well. I mean, there's nothing very much I can add. Firstly, it's an economic project. So I don't really see why it should threaten the Vietnamese. If there's going to be a canal built, canals tend to be good things. Can I just say, to give an example, Turkey, which has a very complicated relationship with Russia, has a project to build a canal around the Dardanelles. Dardanelles is this, the straits that go from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. And of course, the Dardanelles is a very sensitive point from a Russian point of view, because the Russians don't like to have Western warships going into the Black Sea through the Dardanelles. There is a treaty between, not just in China, not just to Russia and Turkey, but many different countries, which regulates how warships can move through the Dardanelles. And the Russians were very, very worried when the Turks said they wanted to build this canal, that the canal would not be covered by this treaty, and because Turkey is a NATO country, that it would enable Western warships to enter the Black Sea and circumvent, if you like, the regulations that were there. And there was a lot of concern on the Russian side, and there was discussions about this between the Russians and the Turks. And eventually the Russians said, okay, look, you've given us the reassurances we need. It's a commercial, economic project. It doesn't appear to have strategic significance, so we're going to let it go. Now, in the event, the Turks have not moved ahead with it. But it seems to me that looking at this project that the Cambodians are building or wanting to build, it's a commercial project. So what's the problem? Why is this issue? I mean, why is Vietnam unhappy about Cambodia developing its economy in the way that it is? Now, I'm going to give a guess, and this goes back to colonial times, which is, of course, this whole territory used to be Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Used to be part of what was called French Indochina. The French were the colonial power, and I think they ran everything, if I'm correct, from Hanoi. That was the French colonial capital. And of course, they did what all colonialists did. They didn't reflect the historic and national boundaries. And when the movement that began in Vietnam for independence from the French took form, it was specifically an Indochina movement. They wanted to keep this whole region together, with Hanoi still at the center of it. And of course, Laos had good relations with Vietnam, and Cambodia, for a very long time after the wars with the Americans, became in effect a satellite of Vietnam. And I think to some extent has continued to be until fairly recently. And I suspect that what worries the Vietnamese is that with this canal project, Cambodia will develop its economy. It will become less dependent on Vietnam. It will develop its own independence and its own independent identity. And the Vietnamese will lose influence over Cambodia, and particularly lose influence over Cambodia to China, which is the colossus in this region. And way back in the 70s and 80s, I remember that there was a kind of duel for influence, specifically in Cambodia, between Vietnam and China. To my mind, all of this is out of date. It's completely out of date thinking. I mean, there's no possibility now of creating an Indochina system. I
Mhm.
mean, that collapsed with the French. It was never viable. Um, Laos has an independent identity. Cambodia has an independent identity. Probably Cambodia would want good relations with Vietnam anyway. If the Vietnamese wanted good relations with Cambodia, there's no reason why there shouldn't be independent relations. And I think ultimately, if Cambodia becomes prosperous and rich, it's a small country. It's no conceivable threat
Mhm.
to Vietnam, which is a much, much bigger country. And I don't think that there's any sense in which economic development in Cambodia is going to lead to a growth of Chinese influence there or anything of this kind. I suspect we're looking at people in Hanoi, old guard figures from the past. There's still apparently quite a few of them. They remember these old quarrels and all these old battles, and they're clinging to them a little. I suspect that there's been a change of leadership, as you probably know, in
Yeah.
Vietnam. I suspect that as time passes, all this will iron out. But I think this is probably the history of it.
And I think somehow this thing caught Vietnam a little bit off guard. I think,
Yeah,
like you said, that Vietnam probably overly confident that this will never been built, even
yeah,
though this has been talked from
yes,
Cambodia's perspective, has been talked a long time. So there's
yes,
no secret Cambodia wants this to happen, and Cambodia cannot do it by itself. It needs China to do this.
yes,
And now, in that case, if you were the Vietnamese, you should know that China has this card, and that could be very in a way detrimental in Vietnamese eyes, because they used to have the monopoly because the Mekong
yeah,
River goes out to the sea, and now there's
yes,
another opening. So that
yeah,
I think is very much worrying them. Plus, they divert water also goes to this
yes,
canal. Depends on how
yes,
deep the canal is, and
yeah,
that part of Vietnam agriculture surrounding the Mekong River is very important. So the two things varies Vietnam. But if
yeah,
that's the case, Vietnam shouldn't be upsetting China like that, right?
no.
Should why do this Vietnam doing things to they know will anger China?
Because, and this is another aspect of Vietnam. I mean, by the way, just to touch on all these economic things, Vietnam has a booming economy. I mean, it's
Hmm.
growing very, very fast. Partly it's growing so fast because it's got good relations with China itself. I do not believe that the construction of a canal is going to make a fundamental difference to Vietnam's economic situation. And Vietnam clinging to a monopoly position on trade through the Mekong is ridiculous. It's silly. I mean, it's the sort, again, the kind of old-fashioned thinking. It's the kind of thing that might have made sense when all of these are very underdeveloped agricultural peasant economies back
Hmm.
in the 50s. But I mean, today, I mean, this is all, I mean, Vietnam as a dynamic, very rapidly growing economy, good economic relations with China. Cambodia, a much poorer economy, wanting to develop. From Vietnam's economic point of view, having a prosperous and rich neighbor they can trade with is in its interest.
It's
Just,
interesting.
just, just, just to say. But again, the reason the Vietnamese have done this is because, again, they kick against the pricks, as we say in England. Kicking against the pricks is an expression that comes from horse riding. The horse, you ride the horse, and you try and control what the horse is going to do. And every so often, the horse does its own thing because it wants to remind the rider that it's got its own mind. So this is what Vietnam does. They're a big country, they're a rich country, they're a rising country. They have a very long history with China, going all the way back, well, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Um, they fought wars under the Ming dynasty with China,
Yeah.
which for some reason is very important to them still. I mean, it's apparently part of their identity. I understand that their language is very close to
Yeah.
Chinese.
Yeah.
So I mean, I
Mhm.
believe that. Culturally, they're very, very close to China.
Mhm.
I also understand. And they are conscious that China is this colossus next door, and they want every so often to show the Chinese, look, we're still here, we're still strong, we're an important country, we're doing very well, we can make our friends where we want to, we can engage in, exercises with the Filipinos if we want to, we can expand our shelf, we can lay claim to all kinds of islands, which we're not really interested in, and we'll never develop ourselves. So we're going to do all of these things basically because, well, that's part of who and what we are, and it's sometimes a mistake to look at these kind of disputes between countries too logically. Big countries. I remember I'm from Greece, so I come from a small country. Big countries, China, for example, tend to do that because you have a big country has the sort of if it's not America, a big country has the confidence, the stability, the sense of insecurity that they can, the self-assurance to think in a completely pragmatic way about things. But smaller countries, particularly if they're close to very big ones, sometimes feel that they have to assert themselves in ways. And I think this is what the Vietnamese are doing. I think this will only go so far, by the way. I think that the Vietnamese eventually, because I've met Vietnamese, and they're very intelligent people. They're very big community here in London, for example. I think they do not want to get drawn ultimately into major superpower conflicts either. So yes, they will push back against China in some way. There'll be this constant game of niggling and harassment. Maybe the new leadership in Hanoi wants to assert itself a little, show to China, that don't assume that we can be taken for granted. Play that kind of game. It's never really a good idea, but I have to say, coming from a small country myself, Greece, I know exactly why it's done.
Just so you know, the new leader already said right after this canal, it announced it's going to start building. He announced that the first overseas visit will be China. Just so you know.
Well, there you go. So exactly. So he has to. He knows at some level. He knows that he has to maintain the good relationship with China, and China is just too important to Vietnam. And again, maybe once upon a time, in Chairman Mao's day. I don't know this for a fact, but maybe back in the 60s, there was real reasons to think in Vietnam that China wanted some kind of preeminence in Vietnam. But again, this is old, outdated things. Nobody in Beijing thinks like that anymore. They want good relations. They want stable relations with their neighbors. And Vietnam is an old country as well. It's a country which the Chinese know very well. The Chinese, by the way, gave Vietnam an enormous amount of assistance during the war with the Americans. And I think in the end, they'll find their way out.
And that also shows you the different ways of handling conflict. Vietnam did something China really not very happy, but instead of, aircraft carriers will come, China just said, okay, we'll build a canal in your neighbor country.
Well, or sanctions or something of that kind, all that sort of thing. Well, exactly. Well, again, this is the self-confidence of a big, very, very big, very old country with a huge tradition of statecraft behind it.
Yeah, and that explains we're talking about why China and Asia still can be peaceful, because China handling things differently. I think
exactly.
Exactly. Okay, the Middle East. So just the recap. All right. So after the assassination of the Hamas leader inside Iran, so about 2 weeks has passed. Everybody assuming that Iran will have some kind of retaliation action, but so far it hasn't happened. Although there have been constant say, next 24 hours, next 48 hours, but nothing happened. Now, some people are saying it's because of the Olympic. I don't know, but some people are saying that. Anyway, so Sunday, Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, called the Iranians acting foreign minister. And that some people interpret that as a support because Wang Yi did express that, they condemn
Mm.
assassination and believe that Iranian has the right to defend itself, something like that, to keep the peace and stability, etc. Now, that has been interpreted by some as China's official support for Iran's
Mm.
retaliation. Okay. Because then followed on Monday, there was a statement from Britain, France, and Germany that a joint statement asking Iran to and its allies to refrain from retaliation. But yesterday, Tuesday, Iran rejected that. Now, what's going to happen? Is Iran going to attack Israel, or Israel going to preemptively strike Iran? What's next?
Well, I think one of the key things is to look at that statement that the five Western powers issued on Monday, and that statement is one of the most astonishing statements I have ever read, and it is going to make the situation in the Middle East much worse, um, because instead of doing what Wang Yi did, and by the way, I don't think Wang Yi was seeking to escalate the situation or encourage Iran to launch strikes against Israel or do anything of that kind. What he was trying to do was to tell the Iranians, look, I understand how you feel. What the Israelis did was absolutely outrageous, assassinating the chief negotiator of Hamas, who is a friend of your president, your new president. It turns out that they're friends. On the very day that your new president is being inaugurated in your capital. That really crossed all the red lines. It was completely wrong. And we want to let you know that that's what we think and that's what we feel. And by saying that, that gives Wang Yi actually, and any diplomat, any real diplomat trying to de-escalate the situation, that gives them some degree of leverage because the Iranians can take away from that the fact that the Chinese understand their concerns, understand the way in which Iran has been treated by Israel over the last few weeks, and then having conveyed to the Iranians that you have that degree of empathy and understanding with them in that situation, you can then tell the Iranians, look, I've said all of this. Now listen to the advice of a friend, and you can see that I am a friend. And do this or don't do this or whatever it is. Take that kind of approach. Now, on Monday, and this is now so consistent, the Western powers did the diametric opposite because the statement they issued was an incredible one. First of all, they don't mention the assassination of Haniyeh at all anywhere in the statement. The statement makes no reference to the fact that Haniyeh was in Tehran, that he was assassinated in the way that he was, that the Israelis killed him, anything of that kind. They show no understanding or concern or sympathy for Iran's position. They talk about Iran making threats against Israel, committing aggression against Israel. The statement actually uses the word Iranian aggression against Israel. This is just after Israel has assassinated, as I said, a guest of the Iranian government in Iran's own capital. They talk about Iran's support for terrorist groups. They talk about their determination to defend Israel. And they say that Iran must stand down. They also say, by the way, that they want a ceasefire in Gaza and the release of hostages without mentioning that Israel has just assassinated the chief negotiator of the other party in the ceasefire negotiations. Well, the Iranians will have seen this statement not just as provocative, but as unbelievably insulting. They've been attacked. They've been attacked in their own capital. A guest of their government has been assassinated just after he met with the new president, and the two embraced. And they're being lectured about aggression, support for terrorist groups, Iran making threats. it's as if Iran is to blame for the whole situation. And that I think is much more likely to make the Iranians take a tough line than what Wang Yi was trying to do on Sunday. And in fact, going on from that, the Western powers followed up that statement with a series of calls by various European leaders to Iran, to President Pezeshkian, the new Iranian president. One of them I know was Keir Starmer, the new British Prime Minister. And apparently, from what I can judge, the tone that these Western leaders took was identical to the one set out in the statement. In fact, they clearly followed up the statement with more threats against Iran. Now, maybe the Iranians don't want to attack Israel. Maybe the Iranians would have listened to the good advice that Wang Yi might be giving to pull back, not to go all in and attack. But today, after these two events, they must feel that they're being pushed into a corner and that they are really being left with no choice. Either they respond or they humiliate themselves. They let themselves be completely humiliated. And that was why they rejected the statement. The statement is astonishing.
And then also they talked about the negotiation that Qatar, Egypt, and the U.S. are apparently mediate some kind of a negotiation supposedly to start tomorrow on Thursday. It's not clear Hamas will even attend. The Chinese media said that Hamas already said they're not going to attend. Now, if Hamas is not there, what's the point having a negotiation there? Plus, if I were Hamas, I mean, why would I? You just assassinated my leader, my main negotiator. Yeah. And there's no sign whatsoever that Israel is serious of any ceasefire, any peace agreement of any kind. Why would Hamas even be interested in this? I mean, what's your take on this negotiation supposed to happen tomorrow?
Well, this is again where we come back to the statement, because if the statement had shown genuine equidistance, had made some criticism of Israel, had said that what Israel did was wrong, and that assassinating the chief negotiator of Hamas in the middle of these negotiations was wrong, then Hamas might have said to themselves, well, our friends all want us to come to a ceasefire deal. Let's go to these negotiations and negotiate, even though the Israelis did this terrible thing. Because the other side, the Americans, the Western powers, are showing that they have some understanding of our position. But when they read a statement like this, and when it talks about Iranian-backed terrorist groups, I mean, Hezbollah presumably is one, but Hamas logically is the other. Well, why would the Hamas want to turn up to a negotiation being mediated or being supported by these countries, which quite openly have said that they don't care whether Israel murders Hamas's chief negotiator, and continue to call them a terrorist group? So, I mean, I'm going to make a guess, by the way. I think the Egyptians and the Qataris are probably furious with this statement. Qatar has already, in the strongest language, condemned the assassination of Haniyeh. They said that they found it incredibly unhelpful. They've been working very, very hard to get these negotiations going. And reading a statement like this, they must have been furious about this. I don't know who drafted it. I don't know who came up with this wording. I sense that it came from the US. But whatever it was, whoever it was who did it, is taking, again, the most unbelievable, reckless risks with the situation in the Middle East, just as this statement is much more likely to cause an Iranian attack on Israel. So it is much more likely to set the conditions, create the conditions for a Hamas boycott of the renewed negotiations tomorrow.
Well, what's the purpose of the statement? Do they? do they really trying to calm the Iranian down? If that's the case, they're doing a horrible job to do so. Or they on the surface trying to say, okay, don't attack, don't retaliate. But in reality, they don't really care. Or in some sense, maybe some Americans even want to see to provoke Iranians even further. I mean, what's the purpose of the statement like that?
Well, this is an excellent question. I mean, it's very difficult to understand what the thinking behind this is. If you wanted to provoke a war in the Middle East, then the Western powers are going about it in the right way. I mean, making a statement like this, following up with what appear to be very aggressive calls to Iran, all might lead you to think that the Western powers are seeking a war against Iran in the Middle East at this time. Now, I say that, of course, the Western powers are busy telling everybody the opposite, that they do not want a war in the Middle East, that they're worried about the effect that might have on the price of oil, that they understand well how a war in the Middle East might get completely out of control. So that then brings us back to two questions. Is it pure incompetence? Is it that the Americans and the other Europeans have such an intense visceral dislike of Iran and are still so emotionally tied up with Israel that their emotional spasm leads them to issue a statement like this, to appear to side with Israel against Iran in a way that, as I said, is completely counterproductive? Or do they perhaps think that if they make these kind of threats to Iran in the way that they are, instead of provoking Iran, it really will cause Iran to back down, which I think, by the way, is likely to be a serious mistake? Or are they generally seeking war in the Middle East? I mean, I suspect there are some people in Washington who perhaps are. I mean, there's always been a sort of drumbeat in Washington of people who do want, to bomb Iran and believe that this would be a very easy thing to do and imagine that an attack on Iran is going to lead to a good outcome. I don't believe that for one microsecond, by the way. But, I know that there are people in Washington who really think that. So, it's difficult to explain this statement. But in terms of the situation that we have in the Middle East now, it was the worst possible statement that could have been made.
In other words, if they really want to peace, I mean, between Iran and Israel, they probably shouldn't say anything. Just let Wang Yi do the job. Maybe it's better.
Oh, absolutely. that goes without saying. I mean, absolutely let Wang Yi do the job. But of course, hell will freeze over before they ever do that. I mean, the idea of letting China come in, step in and sort out the problems of the Middle East, which the West has been busy making worse for the last 100 years, is unthinkable.
Yeah. Okay. Speaking about that, going to Europe. Now, Russia apparently told the Vučić, Serbia president, that the United States is plotting some kind of thing to cover a revolution and overthrow him. The remarkable, now that's nothing new. We know that the Americans always do this kind of thing, never stop. But I have two questions. One is, it's pretty remarkable. The United States, I haven't seen even deny that. I don't think they even deny that. They don't seem to care anymore. That's what we do. It's almost like, I think that's remarkable. The other thing is, what exactly does the United States want Serbia to do? It's a small country. Whatever Serbia does doesn't make that big of a difference. Why are they, clinging on pressing Serbia to be their, to be on their side? Why is it so important for them to force a country to do something on their side? I don't understand.
Because as you put it very well. This is what the Americans do. By the way, just to quickly say, the Americans, the Russians, and the Serbian government are saying that the United States is trying to organize a regime change in Serbia, and the Americans don't deny it. The Indian media is full of stories about how the United States has just organized a regime change, color revolution in Bangladesh. And again, the Americans are not denying it. I mean, it's quite remarkable. If you read American media reports, they're making no attempt to covering this, to say that all of these allegations, which are being made in India, by the way, are untrue. So, there is, I think, a bureaucratic aspect to this, in that there's now a very, very big regime change community in the United States, various, NGOs and intelligence agencies make huge amounts of money from paid an awful lot by the American taxpayers to do this kind of thing. They just go ahead and do it whenever they can. But in terms of Serbia, there is a specific dimension to this, which is that Serbia is one of those European countries, one of the few remaining European countries, Hungary and Slovakia are the two others, which are withstanding the pressure to, oppose Russia. And this is something that the United States finds intolerable. It cannot, we're talking about China and how China is very relaxed about what Vietnam does overall. It's not going to, as you rightly said, they're not going to send an aircraft carrier or impose sanctions or try to foment a color revolution in Hanoi. The Americans are completely unlike this. In the smallest country, in tiny Montenegro, they get worried about it. If there's protests in Bosnia, for example, within the Serb enclaves there, they get stressed and angry about that too. So they have been trying to overthrow the government in Serbia for almost as long as I can remember. And I don't think there is any specific thing that they want from Serbia. They just want Serbia to be anti-Russian, completely against the instincts of its people.
It's remarkable to me. It's still, to this day, all these things seems down to it is still about control, right? They have to control, full control of everybody, every country, even, like you say, the tiny bit of a country that they just, it's kind of like irritates them that they cannot control this country,
Absolutely. Total control of the entire international system is what the United States seeks and aims for, and has been trying to achieve, by the way, for a very long time, certainly since the end of the Cold War, but arguably even before. And that is the major source of tension in the world today. That is why we have a war in Ukraine, the crisis in the Middle East, the tension in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait. That's why all of these things are going on, because the United States has this obsessive desire to control everything.
But they have to.
By the way, can I just quickly say, I remember thinking this way back in the 1970s. It's a completely forgotten crisis now. But I remember that there was a change of government in Chad, in Africa, and I can even remember the name of some of the political leaders who were involved. Hissène Habré on the one hand, Gukuni Wedai on the other. These are forgotten people today. And for weeks, dominated the foreign news stories in Washington and London and New York, because Chad was apparently this important, very important strategic country. Chad! Look at it. How could it possibly be important to anybody except the people of Chad? But to the Americans, it was incredibly important, and enormous resources were then brought to bear to support the leader, the person that they supported, and to defeat the one that they didn't. And the result was, by the way, an enormous and terrible war in Chad, which went on and on and on and on. It's the same. As I said, the Americans just cannot leave alone. They cannot accept that other countries have a right to choose their own path and to develop their own history.
And some of the effort, I find it's basically wasting their own time. Like not long ago, Blinken visited Mongolia. Now, if you look at the map, Mongolia is between Russia and China. So what can Mongolia do other than upset either Russia or China or both? Doesn't Blinken know that? I mean, anybody, if you can read the map, you can see how what's the best approach for Mongolia to develop, which is have a good relationship with Russia, with China. All right,
Of course.
but Blinken has to go there to stir some trouble. But doesn't he know this will not work? But
He
he still
doesn't.
go there.
He doesn't, because of course, again, the Americans have to have their fingers everywhere. I mean, Mongolia in territory is huge. It's about the size
It's a
of
big,
Europe,
yeah.
but what's got a population, what, 3 million? I mean, it's and as you rightly said, it's between China and Russia. It needs to have good relations with both. Very old. It was one of the countries which had a socialist revolution, by the way, very early on, which was good for it. I mean, developed significantly. But of course, the Americans say we have to support the Mongolian people in their resistance against Chinese and Russian imperialism and whatever it is. And, one gets the sense that the Mongolians want to be left alone to get on with their affairs. And that's very much my sense of the mood in Mongolia today.
Yeah.
A friend of mine, by the way, was a British official who was actually sent to the embassy in Mongolia. And he tells me exactly this. And, but again, the Americans can't leave alone. And they will always, of course, find some people who want to accept their dollars and want to try and create trouble. And what you say, your first point, is absolutely true. The amount, I put aside the material cost of trying to interfere in these countries, which is huge. I remember some years ago, about 10 years ago, there was some political crisis in Kyrgyzstan, but other Central Asian states. And the Russians disclosed how much money the Americans had spent trying to organize it. There was $250 million for a small, impoverished country in Central Asia. They got the leader they wanted. The leader fell almost immediately. The thing swung back to the natural alignment of this country with China and Russia. But anyway, put aside the money, which is basically money thrown away.
Yeah.
The mental energy the US wastes on all of this, mental energy which the US could be using to think about and solve its own problems, is just off the scale. Yeah. I mean, the president of the United States and his officials, instead of worrying about the fact, that there's an economic crisis in America, that there are all these problems in America, all of that, they're wasting their time thinking about Mongolia and all of these things. I mean, or Chad before or whatever. And that's why America is in the mess it's in now.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I really want them to spend more time and energy on the domestic issues. Yeah, absolutely. Ukraine. So Ukraine continued to move into the Russian territory. According to them, they even made some progress. I don't know how much I can trust that. But in any event, what's next? So are they going to go in deep into Russia, or I mean, what's next? I don't quite see how they can move forward.
Well, in military terms, and you see this in some of the West, some of the more intelligent Western countries, that this thing makes absolutely no sense at all. To the extent that one can work it out, the original plan, and this is what the Russians are saying, and I believe them, the original plan was a quick offensive deep into Russia to seize the nuclear power station, which is located near to the city of Kursk, which is not far from the border, about 60 kilometers from the border, something like that, 50 kilometers from the border, seize the nuclear power plant, gain possession of the nuclear power plant, make some kind of an ultimatum to the Russians, and then force the Russians into negotiations whereby the Ukrainians will then regain much of their territory. Now, that is an insane idea. It was an absurd idea. And if that was the Ukrainian plan, I think we can probably say now that it's failed, because there's a Russian general who's saying that they were hoping to do this by the 11th of August, to seize the nuclear power plant by then. Today's the 14th of August. Russian forces are accumulating in this area. The area around the nuclear power station is being heavily fortified. It's almost impossible that Ukraine can capture it. And sooner or later, they're taking enormous losses with this operation. They're being attacked by the Russians in many places, and they're using up, burning up their best troops, even as their front lines everywhere else are continue collapsing. In fact, in some places, the collapse is getting faster because Ukraine is diverting everything it's got left to this operation in Kursk, whereas all the important places are being lost. So, but I think that was probably the plan, as a seize the nuclear power plant, try to leverage it to get a stronger position in negotiations, which they were hoping to organize over the next couple of days, couple of weeks. Now, I have to say, not only is this going to fail, more importantly, and judging from Russian comments, including comments made by Putin himself at a meeting he held in Moscow, he's just held in Moscow, what it's actually done is it's made the Russians decide that the Ukrainians cannot be trusted as partners to conduct negotiations. That when the Ukrainians talk about negotiations, what they are actually doing is planning some crazy operation like this. And as a Russian official put it today, how can you conduct negotiations with such reckless and deluded people? So I think that instead of strengthening Ukraine's position in negotiations, it's probably destroyed the possibility of negotiations. That's what the Russians are saying. Now, I read in Global Times, I don't know how authoritative Global Times is, but I read in Global Times an article that the Global Times published on this affair, and I got the sense that whoever wrote it was very, very angry about it. And I think what's been happening over the last few weeks is that all sorts of people, the Chinese first and foremost, but the Indians, maybe the Turks, others too, have been trying to get Ukraine to sit down with the Russians and to talk. And of course, the Ukrainian foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, came to China a few weeks ago. He met with Wang Yi in Guangdong. He seemed to be talking about Ukraine's willingness to engage Russia in negotiations. He clearly gave the Chinese no hint that anything like this was coming, even though it was clearly already been planned. And I think the Chinese feel very, very angry because they understand very well that what the Ukrainians have done isn't going to put Ukraine in a stronger negotiating position. It's going to prevent negotiations from taking place at all.
Yeah. And some people in the Chinese social media even saying that Zelensky is probably even encouraged a little bit by Kamala Harris polling numbers. Because for a while, it's clear that Donald Trump is going to be the next president. And he said, I'm going to end the war in 24 hours, whatever that means. But he hinted that he's going to bring them to negotiation table, which Ukraine doesn't have much of a bargaining chips, right? So there are people saying, well, maybe he just feel more emboldened because Kamala Harris' number is getting better in the polling numbers. Do you think there's some truth for that?
Yes, I do. I think that just like Netanyahu, who has become much more aggressive over the last few weeks, partly because of the instability in Washington. I think Zelensky it's exactly the same with him. He looks to the United States. He sees that the current president, Biden, is fading away. He is clearly worried about Trump. He wants to do as much as he can, as quickly as he can before the election, in case Kamala Harris fails to win, in which case he's got to deal with Trump. And of course, if Kamala Harris does win, then if he makes some gains between now and November, that will put him in a stronger position. Also, he thinks, because he expects that Kamala Harris is going to back him more. So I think this is probably correct, actually.
Okay. moving to the United States. We're talking about the United States now. What is going on here? Now, the FBI raided Scott Ritter's
Yeah.
home, right? And then Tulsi Gabbard, who is a former congresswoman, she's now under surveillance. She's on some kind of a terror watch list. I'm shocked by reading all these things. Apparently, that happened after she had an interview. Tulsi Gabbard had an interview with Laura Ingraham. And in that interview, she criticized Kamala Harris' foreign policy. And the day
Mm,
after that, she was put on this watch list. What is
mm.
your take on this? What is going on here?
Well, there's everything is being done to close down any public voice that criticizes Kamala Harris. That's what's going on. And at the same time, what we are increasingly seeing is that the deep state, if I can use that expression, is becoming ever more aggressive and ever more assertive in asserting control. So Scott Ritter is being prosecuted because he's being making lots of statements very critical of American policy in Ukraine. The United States has been very angered about this. They've cobbled together this case against him under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. I ought to say that 10 years ago, FARA prosecutions were so rare, I was barely aware of the existence of this law. I knew about it as a historical thing that the United States had introduced in the 1930s. I didn't even know it was still in force. And now suddenly it's been revived and it's been used now basically as a mechanism, as a means to go after American foreign policy critics. And it's also now being used to go after American independent voices within the United States who are potentially critical of the course that the current American government is following, and who might just conceivably assist in the defeat of Kamala Harris in the election. Kamala Harris is conducting a very strange election. I think this is a point to say she's
No,
not giving interviews, she's
no.
not making speeches, she's not doing
Mhm.
any of those things. She's relying entirely on the media to boost her. And of course, up to a certain point, it's working. But that
Mhm.
can only work if there is no criticism allowed of her at all. I mean, this doesn't go out on YouTube. So let me just tell you that
Mhm.
about 2 weeks ago, on YouTube, we did a number of programs on the Duran covering what had happened with the way in which Kamala Harris had become the Democratic Party nominee. And YouTube immediately restricted them. I mean, they
Mhm.
didn't deplatform us or take that kind of step, but we immediately saw that there were huge restrictions
Mhm.
imposed on the circulation of those videos. And for several days afterwards, we were clearly on some kind of a watch.
Yeah. And Colin Maupin's book, I told you, right, about
Mm,
Kamala Harris, he wrote it 4 years ago.
mm.
That Amazon just took it down. I mean,
Yeah, no,
it was there for 4 years, not a
yeah,
problem. But all of a sudden,
yeah,
there's a problem. They just took
yeah.
it down. Yeah.
Yes.
So that's.
It's Orwellian. I mean, it really is. It's actually very sinister. As I said, I mean, I should say straight away, I have my differences with Scott Ritter.
Mhm. Yeah.
We didn't see eye to eye over the Gonzalo Lira affair
Yeah.
at all,
Yeah. Mhm.
and things of this kind. But I mean, the way they're coming after him is terrible.
Mhm.
It is the way they're coming after Tulsi Gabbard is even worse. And of course, they're particularly targeting her because back in 2019, she basically obliterated
Yeah.
Kamala Harris in a television debate, causing Kamala Harris to drop out
Mhm.
of the presidential campaign. And, that's why she's under surveillance. We have all of this going on now. So, and one way or the other, the whole thing is very sinister, very unlike the way in which American elections used to be conducted. Think of something else. There's been an assassination attempt
Uh-huh.
on one of the candidates in the election, Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Do you ever read anything about it anymore?
Yeah.
The media has completely suppressed that story.
Yeah. Well, but in Britain also something similar. I just heard that the British police are arresting people based on their social media posts.
Oh yeah, it's true.
Ah, so Britain follows the American very closely, I guess.
I think to some extent we even lead, in fact, if I can say. Now, can I just explain the situation in Britain? I mean, we've had a long-standing problem with an issue about immigration. Immigration has been very high, basically since the mid 1990s, when the Blair government, for all kinds of reasons, relaxed immigration controls, and in fact appears to have encouraged immigration. At least that's what some people say. I'm not going to. This isn't a program about British immigration policy, but anyway, we had a horrible murder of three little girls, 8 years old. They were at a
Yeah.
Taylor Swift event. They were killed by a very angry and very frightening man, 18 years old, who also tried to kill several other children as well. That story is hardly talked about. I mean, nobody talks about this. All kinds of rumors that circulated. This is not unusual in Britain. People came out and protested. In Britain, it is very common when there's attacks on children for some people to come out and protest. I don't like it myself, but it's very much a part of the British landscape, if you like. And alongside all of that, we got some protests and rioting in British cities, especially in England. Now, if you know a little bit about England, you will know that in August, some degree of disturbance is very common in British industrial cities in August. I think you've been to Britain, but if people who haven't been there probably under the impression that Britain is a very orderly country, and it is in some respects, but not in others. And sometimes, I mean, there are fairly commonly outbreaks of youthful unrest and rioting in English cities in August. The boys are off school. There's a lot of alcohol flowing. The weather is hot. People have nothing to do, and the British riot. This is this is quite standard in British life, and I think that this plus the murder in Southport, this horrible murder, all of this came together, and perhaps we got a little bit more rioting this year in August than we usually do. And of course, it feeds on to the general worry that a lot of people have in Britain about immigration. But one shouldn't overstate this. I know there's been some of the headlines suggest that there's been vast wave of riots and protests in Britain. If you actually read the accounts of what's happened, you will see that they never give a number on the number of protesters that have actually come out. They never do. And I've heard informally that it's something like 3,000 or 4,000 across the whole country. So that gives you a sense of the actual level of this thing. But of course, the government, the media, various political people, the NGOs, the think tanks, they've all seized on this. They've made out that there is this huge, tidal wave of far-right violence sweeping Britain, even though, notice, nobody's been killed or seriously injured at any point during these riots. And as on the back of this, there's now this enormous campaign to tighten up controls, to arrest people, because as they've said things on social media which some people disapprove of. People have been arrested and jailed, not because they were there when some rioting was taking place. They might not have been participating, they might not have done anything, but simply being there now is apparently enough to get you sent to prison. Of course, since this is overall about tightening controls, they will go after everybody, white, black, whatever, old, young, women, men, because this is in the end all about tightening control and controlling information.
Yeah. So if the riot is as bad as they say it is, I mean,
Yeah.
aren't they supposed to do a little bit soul searching? Why the deeper problem, like poverty, inequality? They should have that kind of conversation rather than just tightening the control for the messages, right? I think.
Well, if you read the British media, you will see that they're saying that you mustn't do that. They're talking about investigating why people riot is, in fact, to encourage rioting, and is to show sympathy and support for the rioting. If we haven't got quite to the point where you'd be arrested for saying that, but you'd certainly be very severely criticised if you did.
And talking about the control, now I saw you on the RAN, you and Alexa had a program about this EU Commission.
Yeah.
They sent I guess, a note to Elon Musk before his interview with Donald Trump, basically warn him, okay, no disinformation, no, violence, whatever. The interview didn't take place yet, but they already warned him. Well, my question is what is this is from the EU, right? Not even from the United States. It's none of the EU's business what's going on here. What are they afraid of about this interview?
Well, they are afraid of Donald Trump being elected because the EU doesn't like Donald Trump. I mean, they're very nervous about Donald Trump for all kinds of reasons. And I'm not just Donald Trump the person, but Donald Trump, the mythological cartoon character that they've created, who, embodies or represents something that they imagine that he's going to do. I mean, I've never understood most of the hysteria about Donald Trump myself. But anyway, this is partly what this is all about. As I said, it's trying to control Donald Trump. And I'm going to say something. The EU, I am pretty sure they were put up to do this by the Democrats in the United States. The Democrats almost certainly called them, tell them, look, our lawfare against Donald Trump isn't succeeding. He's still out there. He's still polling numbers are still pretty strong. We haven't been able to quite bring him down to earth yet. He's now going to give this interview to Elon Musk. Yes, we've arranged a massive DOS attack on it to try and stop people watching it, but people will eventually watch it. So can you please threaten Twitter X, which might eventually circulate this? Can you bring all these kind of information controls? And Thierry Breton, who is a terrible censor and somebody who wants to control everything anyway, he obliged by writing one of the most outrageous and menacing and threatening letters I've ever seen. I mean, it drips with menace. Actually, it's really awful. And then the whole thing fell apart because Elon Musk published the letter on Twitter X. We did a program about it on the Duran, but that was a minor thing. I mean, far too many people saw it. There was much too much commentary. So the EU Commission is now retreating. They say, oh no, it was all a mistake. He acted all by himself. He went rogue. I don't believe that. But anyway, that's what they're trying to say now. It's very much, again, coming back to what we were saying before, it's very, very much part of the climate, the political climate that we have today.
Yeah, and Donald Trump was the president for 4 years, and I mean, he's not that horrible. I mean, he's no different. I don't say he's a good president, achieve much, but he's not as threatening as they thought he would. So what more can happen this time? I don't quite got it. The Guardian had an article from an ex-Twitter boss, Bruce Daisley, calling for arrest of Elon Musk. That Elon Musk need to be arrested. I find it just mind-boggling that people are so obsessed with this whole thing.
I completely agree. I mean, I read an article about 2 weeks ago by a very famous journalist in Britain called Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times, talking about Donald Trump. This was shortly after the assassination, by the way. And It's just incredible to read. I mean, he was talking about Trump the dictator, Trump the tyrant, Trump the betrayer. I mean, it's one thing like that after another. And, I was waiting to see
Hmm.
what Trump has done
Yeah.
that Gideon Brackman thinks justifies using this kind of language about him. And of course, there's nothing like that. I mean, he has different ideas about policy,
Yeah.
but tyrant, dictator, betrayer. I mean, it's traitor. I mean, it's all. It is very deranged.
Yeah.
It is very, very mad. Now, I don't know whether you've heard of him, but there's this very celebrated American law professor, Jonathan Turley,
Uh-huh.
and he's a major defender of free speech and is very, very concerned about all of the various things we've just been talking about. He's a professor at George Washington University, and he's also a very, very brilliant practicing lawyer and a very decent and good man. Anyway, he's written this book about the dangers to free speech in what he calls the age of rage. I don't think we're living through the age of rage. I think we're living through the age of hysteria because this is all hysterical. I mean, a couple of hundred young people riot in England. It's, as I
Mhm.
said, absolutely standard in England in August. We have, Tulsi Gabbert saying a few things about Kamala Harris, which some people don't like, which is absolutely standard in elections. We have Donald Trump. I mean, the whole thing is completely out of proportion. It's crazy. Donald Trump gives an interview to Elon Musk. Some people are saying that Elon Musk should be arrested. I mean, the whole thing is, as off the scale. It's crazy.
And there's not a whole lot. I don't know. Did you listen to the interview? It was 2 hours long. And I tried to listen to it last night from the beginning to end. I didn't pay close attention. I just let it
Yeah.
running, at the. I didn't hear anything that is stand out. What is your take
Yeah.
on that? Anything
Well,
new?
there was nothing very new, actually. I mean, a lot of things that he said, which are fairly sensible. But I think the single thing about that interview, which I think is alarming for all the people we're talking about, is that, Trump, when you see him and you hear him, well, he's a human being. I mean, he's not this, demonic figure that we're all led to think he is. I mean, he talks, quite, sensibly sometimes not so sensibly, but he, talks and he sounds normal, he sounds human. And I think this is something that they simply can't come to terms with. That, I mean, they're frightened of because
Yeah.
it's so completely contrary to the sort of image of Trump that they're trying to create.
Probably going back to the control. It just still they want to control everything, and they
Absolutely.
feel like Trump is a person they cannot easily control. Probably that's still what it is. They're afraid of that part. And
I think that is right, but I think
uh-huh.
also again they've. I mean, it is a sense of control, but I
uh
think also that somewhere along the line, a real hatred of Donald Trump seems to have entered into the system,
mhm.
and it is driving everything. I
Yeah.
mean, like the FBI director, no less, contradicting the FBI itself, the organization that he heads, by saying that it wasn't a bullet, or might not have been a bullet that pierced Trump's ear when everybody knows that it was, and the FBI itself says that it was. I mean, why did he even need to do that?
Yeah.
Obviously, because he's become utterly fixated with Trump. Yeah, as I said, it's very bad, and hatred and obsession is incredibly dangerous thing. It leads to all sorts of incredibly dangerous outcomes. And America, of course, has written the great book about obsession, which is Moby Dick, about this, captain who wants to kill a whale.
But
And he kills himself and all his crew because
mhm.
he's, obsessed with this
That's it.
monotrack, single-minded thing.
Yeah. And I mean, now there seems their hatreds towards Trump spill over to Elon Musk now.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
seems, and
absolutely.
yeah. But Musk now invited Kamala Harris for an interview.
Yeah,
They called they called him, the Harris camp called Elon Musk a lackey of the Team MAGA. So we'll see if she will, like
of
you
course she
said,
won't.
she,
She's not going
yeah,
to give an interview to Elon Musk. I mean, quite a lot. She doesn't want to. I mean, she doesn't want X to be, to become even still more popular, but also she doesn't want to give an interview. She wants to give
yeah.
the only kind of interviews she will have are with people who the Democrats control.
just just like I don't know if you remember when Barack Obama was running
Mm,
the
mm,
they were giving him very friendly interview
yeah,
to the degree that there were some Hillary Clinton supporter can't even stand it. So on Saturday Night Live, I don't know if you remember, they have one
mm,
episode. They marked this interview. So somebody the pretended, reporter
yeah,
interviewed Barack Obama. Can you tell me how brilliant you are?
yes, and
that kind of interview.
yeah, yeah, yes,
They're going to, yeah. That's also, I find it also very odd that Kamala Harris, ever since he became the presumptive candidate for the Democratic Party,
yeah,
she hasn't given any interview. Yeah,
yes,
yes, I find that's remarkable. My take is that she's afraid of all the questions, and some even slightly challenging questions she might not be able.
absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely. And I also get the sense that her minders sense that if she appears on television, she doesn't come across very well to
uh-huh.
many people. Maybe
Yeah.
unfairly, by the way. I mean, it's sometimes people don't come across well on television, and you
Mhm.
discover that they're not actually as bad as they seem. But whatever.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because other than she's laughing all the time, even for things that kind of like odd. That seems like
Yeah,
her character, right?
yeah,
Her, yeah. It will be see. I mean, I agree. I don't think she will agree to it, but that
yeah.
will make her look bad because Musk interview, ask her, invite
Yeah.
her, and she
Yes.
cannot come. Yeah.
Well, I know, but of course, they'll pretend that they'll spin it in some way that that she's not going to expose herself to an interview by this MAGA supporting tech billionaire or something of that
Yeah.
kind. I mean, that'll be what they will say.
Yeah. Okay, the Olympic. I still want to talk a little bit about the Olympic. So, the Olympic now finished, which I
Mm,
guess is kind of interesting. That as
mm,
soon as the game is over, I saw the Washington Post had an article. Here's the title of the article: "The 12 medals that the Chinese swimmers won in Paris will forever be tainted."
yeah.
So the game is already over, but they cannot let it go. Are
No.
they trying to lay the groundwork now? Because now the Chinese media are discussing, okay, the next game will be in Los Angeles. They're going to do everything. The United States is going to do everything, in its power to rig the game one way or another. So they started already now, seems like, to taint it. I mean, what does the 12 swimmers do? That you can use the word tainted. They have been tested, and tested, and nothing came out of it. And
Yeah.
yet, here's an article saying their medal has been tainted. I mean,
I, I
what's
see, I've seen this whole thing before. I've seen it play out exactly this way, and this happened after the Sochi Olympics in Russia. Russia, of course, in the Soviet Union, used to be very, very strong in the Olympic Games. Often, nearly always, it surpassed the US in the medal table. And the Americans were very, very annoyed about that, but they had to accept it in those days because international sports was organised very differently. Um, More recently, um, as we discussed in our last program, big money has also gone into the Olympics. So winning an Olympic gold medal involves making, well, anybody who does it becomes very, very rich. The trainers become very, very rich. The advertisers become very rich in America if they can show constant American victories, all of that sort of thing. So the Sochi Olympics happened in Russia. The Russians came top of the medals table.
yeah,
And immediately afterwards, the campaign began that they were involved in taking drugs. Some of them were. I mean, there
mhm,
was some
yeah,
of that going on, not on anything like the scale that the Americans pretended that there was, but there was. There was investigation after investigation. The team was eventually banned from participating in the Olympics at all. It became incredibly aggressive. And of course, all this even before the events in Ukraine. The events in Ukraine take place. What started as a temporary ban looks like it's now essentially a permanent ban. And I think this is what has happened. It was really ultimately about knocking out Russian competition. And I'm not saying that they're necessarily going to do this against China. I think there might be some understanding in the US, or some people might understand in the US, that if they really do that with China, it's going to be, it will destroy the Olympics. I mean, if China can't participate in the Olympics, it would be the end of the Olympics. That the country that always does so well in the Olympics now, if it's excluded, after Russia's been excluded, I think more and more countries around the world will conclude that the Olympics are just owned by the Americans. There'll be less interest in participating in them. But the pressure is there. You know, I invented some years ago a concept called the escalatory escalator, which is what the Americans do. That when they start something, I was talking specifically about sanctions there. I remember there's the very first sanctions that the Americans announced against some Chinese officials. This is some years ago, and I said, this is the first step on the escalatory escalator. And they won't, even if they want to get off, now that they've started that going, they won't be able to stop. And I think that we're looking at this, that this thing could easily get out of control, and it might start to happen, as you rightly said, with the Los Angeles Olympics. I think that they won't ban China before the Los Angeles Olympics, but if China does well in the Los Angeles Olympics, if the Chinese have pushed the Americans out of success in various sports, the attacks on the Chinese team will grow. WADA, this anti-doping agency that's been created, will be brought to heel and will be unleashed on the Chinese as it was on the Russians. We'll have all sorts of campaigns, all sorts of angry articles, editorials, demands for banning. The Olympic Committee, International Olympic Committee, will go along with whatever the Americans ultimately say, because it's tied up financially with the Americans. And we could very well end up there, even though I don't think that is the intention today.
I also don't think that they're going to ban the Chinese team, but I think that they will try to put China into disadvantage. For example, they are the one, I guess the hosting country are the one to decide which are the things you can compete. So there are even people suggesting like take out the whole table tennis, take that whole thing out.
Yes.
Things like that, in that nature. Yes. So there will be, the next few years, we will see, I mean, maybe we won't see, but behind the scenes, there will be arm twisting, these kind of power plays in the Olympics, right? That's what's going to happen.
I think you're absolutely correct. And I mean, it is terribly sad.
Yes.
It is absolutely desperately sad to see the Olympics being dragged down in this way. But I think that's exactly what you're going to see, that there's going to be all kinds of attempts to manage the Olympics in the way that exactly the way that you said, to maximize the American Olympic medal table and lower the Chinese one, and try and see off the Chinese challenge. And then, as I said, if after all that, China still appears to be doing well, then, as I said, the escalatory escalator will just go on, going upwards.
Yep. We will see. I mean, just like everywhere else, it seems like the Olympic is another battleground. Everywhere.
Yes. There is, as I said, there is something hysterical about this. It's you you cannot let yourself lose on anything.
Uh-huh.
The whole point about the Olympics was not about winning anyway. Once upon a time, it was about taking part. But the Americans just cannot bear to lose, and obviously they didn't want to lose against the Russians in the Winter Olympics. But losing against the Chinese is going to be even more difficult for them psychologically to cope with.
Well, we will see. There will be plenty of dramas, I'm sure, coming. We will see.
Yes. Well, indeed.
Okay. All right. That's all I have for now. I'm sure before the next Wednesday, there will be more things.
Oh, lots of things. Yeah. Yeah. We're living in very interesting times.
Interesting time. Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much for spending the time. Thanks.
My pleasure.
Have a good
My
day.
pleasure, Sophia. You too. Right.
Bye.